Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Fix family. So we are live, and we're very excited today to be joined by two fantastic chiropractic doctors. We're joined by Dr. Tim Bertelsman and Dr. Brandon Steele, who are both co-founders of the online clinical and business resource platform ChiroUp.com. And we have a fantastic 1 hour webinar today on mastering the rotator cuff. So thank you so much for joining us, Brandon and Tim, today.
Thanks for having us, Meg. We appreciate having the chance to connect with the Fix audience.
Yeah, this should be a fun one.
How's your day been?
Very good. It's about 3 o'clock here in the afternoon, so we've had a chance. This is our second webinar of the day and a couple meetings before that. So now we're excited to talk about things that are in the wheelhouse.
Fantastic. Well, as I said, thank you so much for spending the time to take with us today. So as everyone can read from the description here, so rotator cuff injuries account for 4.5 million physician office visits a year. So today we're really lucky to be joined by Brandon and Tim. These two gentlemen obviously need no introduction, but we'll give them a quick intro before we get started. So Dr. Bertelsman had graduated from Logan College of Chiropractic with honours, and he's been practicing since 1992. He lectures nationally on various clinical and business topics, and he's been extensively published and also presented at the recent Fix Symposium. So we're very fortunate to have both Dr. Steele and Dr. Bertelsman. And Dr. Steele, so Dr. Brandon has been in private practice at the Premier Rehab in the greater St. Louis area, and he began his career with a postgraduate residency at the Central Institute for Human Performance. And during this opportunity, he was able to create and implement rehab programs for members of the St. Louis Cardinals, the Blues, and the Rams. And as we mentioned, both are co-founders of the online clinical and business resource, ChiroUp.com. And as Fix members, we have a unique discount available for ChiroUp.com, which we can discuss at the end of the webinar. But for now, I think everyone's kind of ready to see me drop myself off the screen because they didn't come here to listen to me. So I will pass over to the both of you. So thank you so much for being here today again.
Thank you, Meg. We appreciate the intro to the Fix audience, and we're looking forward to talking about the rotator cuff. We're going to share 3 crucial fundamentals in the next half hour, 45 minutes together, as far as mastering the assessment and the management of the rotator cuff, that all of us who are already familiar with the rotator cuff recognize it's a pretty consistent pattern of dysfunction, that you don't just develop a rotator cuff rupture or even a rotator cuff tear. Most of the time you had some other problems before that. In fact, the research tells us that in order to have a tear, 95% of those people had some degree of shoulder impingement syndrome prior to that. And Dr. Charles Neer said 100% of those patients who had shoulder impingement had scapular dyskinesis. So if we move down the line to tears, if we don't manage the first part, then we probably got an issue.
It's a continuum, just like any other part of our body. It's really when you see the patient. So it's not necessarily they have impingement syndrome or they have a rotator cuff tear. They've already gone through those stages. So the critical thing that we need to do is not only recognize what tissue gave way, but we also need to recognize those precursors to understand how to get this person not only out of pain, but sometimes a little more difficult, how to keep them out of pain. So it's not just looking at which muscles are tight, the phasic muscles, the large movers, we're going to find they're often tight and irritated just because they're doing a job they're not supposed to do. We really need to look at what's happening underneath to find out why this shoulder is going through a painful situation.
Yeah, great point. So really, we'll look at 3 groups of muscles that play a role. We're all familiar with the large movers, the deltoid, the pec, the lat. Those muscles almost always work. We rarely have a failure of the deltoid to do its job properly. But those muscles also tend to migrate the humeral head upward. Think about when the deltoid contracts, we're going to get some encroachment or some impingement. So there's a second group of muscles being the rotator cuff, and those 4 muscles' job is to generate torque, but it's also to help depress and retract the humeral head to create a little bit more subacromial space and protect the tissues in that subacromial space when we abduct our arm. And then the third group of muscles, which we don't think about as much until the next half hour, are the scapular stabilizers. Those muscles like the serratus anterior and the lower trapezius, which help to rock the shoulder blades acromion out of the way as we elevate our arm. And all of those muscles, the 17 muscles of the shoulder that make up those 3 groups, need to work in concert. If one of those band members is not playing properly, there's a problem. And we call that problem scapular dyskinesis. One of the prime players in scapular dyskinesis is this guy.
The serratus anterior. And when we find that when we were treating the rotator cuff, whether it's for impingement syndrome or rotator cuff tear, that it's usually some sort of glenohumeral instability. It's moving too much and it's causing something to fail. So we need to start at the very base of it for stability. Ben Kibler, a great orthopedic surgeon down in Kentucky, said we need proximal stability for distal mobility. Unfortunately, we pay the price of the glenohumeral joint because it's the ball on the flat surface. I mean, it's a little bit concave, 5 to 9 millimeters concavity. That's not a lot of stability for the glenohumeral joint. So we need muscles to support the entire shoulder girdle and then through the shoulder down through the elbow and hand. It really starts the shoulder blade. So when we work on the back and work on the knees and we forget about the core, bad things are about to happen. If we work on the shoulder but forget about the shoulder blade and forget about the ability for that shoulder blade to now depress back into the thorax and now adduct as you're picking your arm up, if you don't have that, unfortunately, bad things are going to happen. So what we'll find with scapular dyskinesis is when it's not moving enough or it's moving too much, bad things happen. Now, demographically, our patients who are a touch older, not to point fingers or anything, their shoulder blades don't move quite as much. And as we do get older, we'll find that we need to help move that shoulder blade a little bit more to help the glenohumeral joint. And what we'll find with our younger patients is that they have too much mobility. If you look at a young female or a young athlete playing baseball, you can almost go in there and grab their shoulder blade. There's so much mobility. And those are the people who need some stability to their shoulder blade. What we'll find is that when those people have some injury there, the muscles that are really tight, those dominant muscles from their postural repetitive stresses, the peck, the biceps, those are the ones that really rock that shoulder blade forward. And if you remember your thorax is a barrel, it's going to now pull that shoulder blade away from the spine and create an issue where now you have a very weak base of support for their arm.
Yeah, those are great points that I like to think of these muscles kind of be the bungee cords of the shoulder. Most of the time, this problem, scapular dyskinesis, is not from some sort of dysfunction as far as glenohumeral osteoarthritis or a nerve that's not working. It's healthy muscles that are just out of balance with each other. Muscles have to be centrated in order for a joint to work properly. So if I flex and extend my finger, I could do that hundreds of thousands of times. But if I put a rubber band on each side and then started to pull on it, if one of those rubber bands was much larger and thicker than the other one, now we're going to start to see some problems. We'll see decentrated joint, meaning it's not in its optimal surface relationship throughout that range of motion. There's a stretch of the capsule, there's compression of cartilage, there's a chronic stretch which makes one side weaker and a chronic shortening which makes another side tighter. And that's a self-fueling cycle of imbalance that we often see in our scapular dyskinesis patients who often have upper cross syndrome or a forward head, forward shoulder posture too. So think about the rubber bands that are bungee cords that attach onto the shoulder. The short head of the biceps and the pec minor attach onto the coracoid. So they're pulling that forward, rocking that shoulder blade forward, while the serratus anterior in the back, the overlooked muscle that we just covered, supposed to attach the shoulder blade, the medial border of the shoulder blade, onto the rib cage and hold it up against the rib cage. It becomes weak and it allows that winging to occur. So when these rubber bands are too tight and those rubber bands are too weak, we have a shoulder that has dyskinesis. Most of the time, healthy muscles that we can change, but if we don't change, eventually that scapular dyskinesis, which is present in 3/4 of healthy college athletes, turns into this, the second stage, shoulder impingement.
And it's important to note that if you look at the scapular assistance test and the scapular retraction test, those are two things that we included in ChiroUp that I think help me as a provider significantly really determine, is the shoulder blade at play? So most of our joints you really can't change the position of, but the scapulothoracic joint you can. So with Dr. Bertelsman, if you just take, and he turns aside, and you take him and rock his shoulder blade backward and then have him perform the same shoulder flexion or abduction, and his pain goes away. And if you can create some stability and act as his serratus anterior, act as his lower to middle trap, you're telling him, hey, scapular stability is going to help you. The same thing would go for my 80-year-old, that if I provide mobility and help rock the scapula up and outward and adduct it from the spine and their pain goes away, now we can tell that we need some mobility. Unfortunately, if you have not enough scapular mobility or stability, bad things happen down the chain, and one of those is the most common cause of shoulder problems, which is impingement syndrome. If each and every one of you rock your shoulders forward and really have the posture everyone has, not just here in America, and then try to pick your arm up as high as possible, you're only going to go so far. And unfortunately, if you do that, you're really locking your spine in a certain position. You don't have upper thoracic spine extension. The shoulder blade is going to be locked into adduction, and you can't pick up your arm as high. And every single one of us impinge that supraspinatus under the acromion. The question is who's hurting it? Who's not able to recover from that on a regular basis? We as chiropractors all day long are pushing and pulling and doing the activities that we do. And if we don't give it enough time to heal, it eventually becomes more and more irritated, ultimately resulting in an office visit.
Yeah, there's a hard bony surface on top and a hard bony surface underneath with some squishy stuff in the middle that doesn't like to be compressed repetitively or tensioned repetitively either. We'll get to that in a second. And sometimes that causes symptoms. Those symptoms are oftentimes pain in the anterior aspect of the shoulder and radiating out toward the deltoid. As soon as somebody tells you they have pain here radiating out to the deltoid, you are certain it's one of 20 possibilities, right? Everything refers to the anterior shoulder and out toward the deltoid. So we'll talk about some tests to identify which part of that shoulder dysfunction continuum does that patient live in. But pain that radiates into their shoulder, especially with overhead movements, initially probably only symptomatically when they're stressing it or when they're lying on it at night. But then over time, that tendon begins to degenerate and turn into a constantly tender tendon, especially at nighttime. One of the classic signs of this problem is somebody has a painful arc.
I always love these problems because the patient tells you they're diagnosed before you even put your hands on them. So patients who have a painful arc test, they're not able to clear that acromion. So the shoulder blade is not moving up appropriately. A lot of times when you have a lot of hypertonicity within the superior glenohumeral ligament, the medial glenohumeral ligament, the pecs, the biceps, you're kind of putting yourself in a position that you can't get mobility out of your arm, and it locks the shoulder blade in that adducted position and protracted position. So it's really up to us to figure out, yeah, it hurts between here and here, but is it truly the supraspinatus? Now, fortunately for us, well, fortunately for everybody, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research supporting some orthopedic tests. So there's two great orthopedic tests to identify, does someone have impingement syndrome?
Show those to us. How about if you just go through the exam, run through the tests now?
So first one is going to be, empty can. So first off, I'm going to usually do Hawkins-Kennedy Nears test, which just slide those around. I guess empty can is a pretty good differentiator test. Let's just skip ahead to Hawkins-Kennedy. Let's first identify, does someone have impingement syndrome or not? So nice and relaxed. Now, most of your orthopedic books are going to have the patient 90 degrees shoulder flexion, and now you're going to move into about 10 degrees of adduction and really force some excess compression in the subacromial space. I'm supporting him. He's nice and passive. Then I'm going to force him into a little bit of relax, a little bit of internal rotation. He does not have very good internal rotation, but once again, probably in a different demographic. So that's a positive Hawkins-Kennedy test. Now, don't forget that when you're doing this test, just pain isn't enough to document in your notes. You want to see pain that's here, not radiating down into your arm. The next one being Nears test, so fully internal rotated arm, keeps his elbow straight. I'm now creating some compression here, not allowing his clavicle to go up, and I'm going to go all the way through full flexion, and we're looking for reproduction of pain at that anterior superior part of the shoulder, non-radiating, no pain, numbness, or tingling. If I reproduce pain, it tells me, hey, I have irritated tissue. That's a positive orthopedic test. I can tell that patient has been doing something to their shoulder to create their problem. Now we need to make the differentiation. Is it truly just an irritated muscle, or is there weakness within that muscle? So the empty can test is a great test for that. You can do this in the sagittal plane or go in the test is normally done in the scapular plane. He's in 90 degrees, elbow straight. I'm now going to push down. He's going to push upward. If you detect weakness, he has gone past that stage of impingement, and now he's showing that tissue is no longer able to bear that load. His capacity is decreased. So I'm really going to be suspicious over a rotator cuff tear. But if it's just painful, then I'm thinking, yeah, this is probably just a rotator cuff. I'm sorry, an impingement syndrome.
So now how do you differentiate if that impingement is the reason for the patient's pain and if it's a mobility or a stability issue?
And those are tests that, the doctor, and we have them right here, but the functional test. Because if you can change someone's pain immediately, like this, you've built a level of trust with that patient. So patients don't come into you and say, I want you to fix my impingement syndrome. They have no idea what those things are. They can't even spell scapular dyskinesis, neither can I. They want to pick the cup of coffee off their cover. So first thing in the morning, that's their task they want to do. You need to make sure that you provide a service that's able to meet their goals. So I use the scapular assistance and retraction test. So those are ones that I showed before, but let's imagine, George here is having issues with picking his arm up. Let's say He picks his arm in a sagittal plane, he gets to 120 degrees, and that's it. So what I'm going to try to do is try to improve that range of motion. I say, George, that's great, you're 120 degrees. Let's see if changing the orientation of your scapula helps with your pain presentation. So the first thing is I'm going to grab the inferior medial border. I'm going to push on. Now, I would have the patient seated at this point, just for demonstration purposes, just because I'm putting a good amount of force in him to see if I can get that shoulder blade to move. And as he picks his arm up, I'm creating some mobility there. Now, if that helps him, that can turn into my treatment. I can provide some mobility. The 3 sets of 10 repetitions of mobility to the scapulothoracic joint will help mobilize the scapula. Other times, especially in my younger populations, they don't need more mobility. They need more stability. So in that respect, I'm going to use a scapular retraction test. And I'm going to actually do this shoulder. So I'm going to take an inferior medial drive down, and I'm going to essentially be his serratus anterior and lower trapezius. I have my hand here, but I'm not bearing down at all. And I'm going to create some inferior push pressure down. He's going to pick up his arm, and I'm looking for do his symptoms get better? Is he having less pain, and does his range of motion increase? If that happens, then I say, hey, he needs stability. The good thing about this is the patient's like, yes, that helped me. It's an immediate response. If that does help him, you run right into the scapular repositioning test, meaning I can't follow around Dr. Bertelsman here when he's trying to pick up the cup out of his cupboard in the morning. I need to teach him a strategy to help himself. So what I tell my patient, in layman's terms, I say, listen, Tim, you've got a muscle that goes between here, which is the inferior border of the scapula, and his spine. I want you to do about 5 to 10% contraction of that muscle, which is going to posterior tilt the scapula. It's going to help clear that space, the subacromial space. Hold that contraction, and now pick your arm up and see what happens. Other arm, and he's going to pick his arm up and see if that helps. I've just now provided him with a strategy he can use to accomplish that activity of daily living, but I've also teaching him a strategy that hopefully he can incorporate during my rehab process to help artificially create a new motor engram and teach him how to use that shoulder a little more appropriately.
Great test. One of the things that we always want to consider in the differential that we naturally do as chiropractors is, could this be coming from a cervical spine, either a symptomatic or an asymptomatic cervical spine? There was a great study not too long ago in JNPT by the director of research for the McKinsey Directional Institute that said that about half of extremity pain arises from an asymptomatic spine. And the shoulder was one of the prime culprits for that. So sometimes these patients don't have neck pain, but they do have shoulder impingement that looks just like impingement, but it's being ramped up by an irritable nerve root. And so one of the tests that I like to do for that is the arm squeeze test. That the arm squeeze test is really simple as it sounds. Grasp the patient's arm and give it a good squeeze. That squeeze of the arm, if it reproduces discomfort, it did nothing to the shoulder tissue as far as the supraspinatus, the subacromial bursa. But if there's an irritated nerve root that's hypersensitizing everything in the area, it's not going to like that. So the arm squeeze test actually shows some decent sensitivity and specificity for a radicular type problem that may not be symptomatic locally. And here's that study that we had talked about, that 43.5% of extremity pain and almost half of shoulder pain, 47% of shoulder pain, comes from an asymptomatic spine. So something that we don't often forget about as chiropractors, but something that if we really get on the trail that we smell something happening in the shoulder, sometimes don't give it the emphasis that we need to. The other thing that we know is that addressing the spine, particularly the thoracic spine, plays a major impact on how shoulders feel.
Yeah, if you have upper thoracic spine extension, bad things are going to happen to the shoulder blade. So we need to reinforce that just to screen for it. And if that patient's lacking that mobility of the spine, we need to make sure that we manipulate that. Not only manipulate it, not only get it moving, but also keep it moving. And you can use whatever modality, whatever kind of treatment you normally use. We use foam rollers, we do different exercises. One of my favorite exercises, though, for scapular dyskinesis and impingement syndrome, once again, they are 100%. So once you have one, it's only a matter of time before you have the other, is the YTWL. And this is one that, if you have a chance right now, get up and try, because this is one of my favorite exercises to show the patients, because we find muscles they don't even know they had. It's kind of like people with glute amnesia. They sit on their butt all day long, and you try to get them to do a squat or a lunge, and they don't even know how to use their glutes. The same happens in the scapular muscles, the periscapular muscles. So with this one, having the patient in a Y position, and as they're in the Y, now bring their arms back behind their body. T, they bring their arms down to 90 degrees, but as they go back, they bring their arms further behind their body. The W, the elbows go to 90 degrees, the elbows go further behind the body, and then the L, the hands go even further behind the body. If you do that exercise right now, you'll kind of see how, man, you'll really fire all those scapular stabilizers and get to waken them up, facilitate those muscles. So once we facilitate those muscles, we can also stretch the muscles in the front with the corner pec stretch. The corner pec stretch is my favorite exercise to do, even though most people present with impingement syndrome on one side, they're almost always going to have upper cross syndrome, which is that dysfunction on both sides. So yes, you can just do a unilateral pec stretch, but the corner pec stretch with the elbows on the wall, pushing on the wall, hold for 7 seconds, and then going a little bit further is just a great way to help open up the chest and to take away some of that impingement that's happening in the front part of the shoulder.
So we'll go through all of these exercises very quickly, but I want to make you aware that you're able to access all of these. We're going to give you a QR code at the end that you can go into the website and review anything that you'd like. So you can look at the condition protocols for scapular dyskinesis, shoulder impingement, or rotator cuff tendinopathy. You can look at any of the exercises, the ADLs, the tests. So we'll move pretty quickly through the process, but if there's something that you'd like to review, check the QR code at the end and get into the system so that you can access all of those resources. One of the things that's almost ubiquitous with a shoulder impingement problem is somebody who has GERD, glenohumeral internal rotation deficit, that they just can't get that arm around.
Do you want to see what it looks like in real life? It looks a lot like this.
So one thing that we can do to teach that patient to stretch that out is to have them take their hand behind their back and then pull it up a little bit with that sort of mobility. Now, one thing to recognize is when we're measuring these things, it's not dependent just on age, it's also dependent upon hand dominance. Yeah. That your dominant hand, your right hand, is always going to be less flexible than your non-dominant hand. So we don't necessarily need to shoot for them to be equal, we need to shoot for them both to be relatively flexible. Sometimes patients need to start with the lightest amount of movement or flexibility. So the Codman pendulum exercise, leaning forward and doing a circle in 25 circles in one direction, then the opposite direction. This is a good exercise for our patients who complain that they have pain at night. There's a couple of conditions that have pain at night that scare us, but there's also a couple of categories of pain that are somewhat typical. Neuropathies like carpal tunnel syndrome are vascular related. They cause symptoms at night when the blood pressure is down and there's not as much blood pumping. So do tendinopathies, because as we'll see in a minute, these are not things that are inflamed, they're things that are avascular or degenerating. So doing something just to get a little bit of a stretch, get some mobility, enhance some vascularity to the tissue is oftentimes really appreciated by the patient. Most importantly, we need to teach that patient how to get those shoulder blades back. So things like a low row or a ski jumper where the patient is pulling an elastic band backwards to get the serratus involved. And one of the things that we need to do with all of these, the YTWL and the low row and all the exercise that engage the shoulders, is to make sure that they're doing them. So many of our patients who have scapular dyskinesis will look like this when they're doing their retractions, because they don't know how to engage the interscapular muscles. So you'll ask them to do that, and that's what they show you. How's that? That's not it. So we want to make sure that we tell them their arms are along for the ride, but it's their shoulder blades that we're really interested in engaging to kind of over-accentuate, at least on the low row aspect, to make sure that those muscles are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Same thing with a bruger with a band, wrapping an elastic band around their wrists and then pushing their chest out as they're pulling that back. We all know of the bruger relief position, which just kind of offsets that forward head, forward shoulder posture. But we also want to make sure that we're doing something that makes those muscles stronger so that the balance is there. One of the things that I often tell my patients is you can think about good posture, but your posture is much like you're a lifesaver between a couple of rubber bands. Whatever the tone of those rubber bands determines where the lifesaver sits. And if we want to move that consciously for a minute, we can, but as soon as we forget about it, it springs back to whatever the neutral position is. So if we want to get out of this position, we can't just think about it. We have to train those muscles to hold it in that position. Otherwise, you get to move on for a visit with the rotator cuff fairy.
You mean the rotary cuff?
Rotary cuff.
No matter where I lecture, I always hear rotary cuff. This is one of the fun things about the shoulder, though, is because everybody thinks they have one condition when they technically don't. So they've seen a lot of different people who've said, oh, that's a rotary cuff problem, a rotator cuff problem. But if you take a detailed evaluation, you do the right set of orthopedic tests, you can determine this isn't an itis. This isn't something that's inflamed. This isn't just a small insult. This is part of a continual cycle that isn't necessarily the injury, it's the failure to heal from that injury. So what we'll find that I learned in school, with 15 years ago, is that this is what I was raised upon. It was that you had an insult. If the insult was big enough, you tore the tissue or broke the tissue, whatever that tissue may be. And if it wasn't, then you went through an inflammatory process and everybody healed and everybody had a party and everybody was good to go. Unfortunately, this isn't the way things are. We see that when we have any kind of an injury, if you don't take a break from that activity, if you don't give it enough time to heal, if you don't get enough blood flow to that issue, you have cholesterol issues, you're obese, you have you sleep on your shoulder, you're not letting blood flow to the area, it creates ischemia, and that tissue never heals. So unfortunately, this isn't it tore a little bit and it never healed. And now you create a cycle of dysfunction. And this happens everywhere in the body. It doesn't matter if it's for lateral or the shoulder. Now you have weakened tissue. So if you look at the tissue, in this case, we're looking at the rotator cuff, but you can look at any other tissues. What we see is a cycle of dysfunction that, you have a failed healing response because you had to be a chiropractor and you had to go to work 5 days a week and you had to, run a practice. But if you have enough weakness that builds up in here, you have enough of those fascicles that get injured, unfortunately, those muscles do a job. And like Dr. Bertelsman talked about at the very beginning, the job of the rotator cuff is to pull the humeral head down and allow a little bit of inferior glide as you abduct or flex that humeral head. And it also adds compression to the shoulder joint. It's not a very stable joint. You have a ball of a bone on a flat surface. And now it's going to start to ride up and there's squishy stuff in the middle. And that's where we have problems. Unfortunately, this happens over and over again because the person continues on with their sport, their job, their hobby, their habit, or whatever they may be. And this is a continual cycle until eventually that weakness, that degenerated tissue, that beef jerky of a tendon starts to tear, and now we start to have partial or full thickness tears.
And that's been one of the biggest changes that I've seen in the past decade as far as our thought process of going from a chronically inflamed tissue, which is not. After about 72 hours, the histologic signs of inflammation are gone, and it turns into a degenerated type of tissue. So yes, there is the possibility of a tendonitis if you just injured it or if you injure it periodically. But when those stressors persist, the inflammatory process says, you know what, we're going to take off. You don't need us, we're just going to leave. And so it begins to degenerate. It's turning into beef jerky. And that's the point that has changed the way that we manage things. That when I graduated, which would have been like 16 years ago, that thought process was we suppress the inflammation in this chronically inflamed tissue. And it turns out it was already suppressed. The body had already said, we quit. We're not going to continue to supply these inflammatory products. So instead of trying to suppress inflammation, our treatment processes have turned to trying to stimulate a controlled inflammatory reaction in tendons. Not every tissue in the body that's irritated, but in tendons, certainly. The tendinopathy model has changed from doing nice things like ice and ultrasound and maybe even a splint if you really wanted to make sure they couldn't move their shoulder for a long period of time. And now our treatments are just the opposite. They're things like Graston technique and factor technique, rubbing a dull screwdriver across the area to stimulate blood flow, cold laser, shockwave therapy, and exercise, but not just any type of exercise, usually eccentric, but always progressive muscular loading. So let's continue to challenge it more and more. And those treatments have made a huge difference in how we see our outcomes for the area.
And here's the difference. The difference is pain. And pain is usually indicating some kind of inflammatory tissue, some kind of irritated tissue, and weakness. As soon as you find weakness, then there's something that needs to be investigated a little further. For example, if we do a typical orthopedic exam of the shoulder and they have some pain, some impingement, some irritation. But here's 2 tests, actually 3 tests that I'm going to show you to help identify some weakness. So the first one being the teres minor infraspinatus. Now remember, the most common muscle is the supraspinatus as far as being a rotator cuff tear, but the number 2 is the infraspinatus, or the interval between the supraspinatus and infraspinatus. In fact, I'm going to move you right about here. Have the arm fully at 90 degrees flexion. You're going to have about 20 degrees of abduction between his elbow and his side. Now I'm going to move him into full external rotation. We're really going to tighten those muscles up. I'm going to say, hold it right here, and I'm going to let go of his hand. And what he's going to do is he's going to be able to hold that position and relax. Someone who has a tear in those muscles, as soon as you let go, it's going to be, that hurt. And that's a lag sign. That's a positive sign that you went and you stress that muscle. You stress it beyond its ability, and it says, no, I can't do that anymore. there's a really high sensitivity and specificity for a rotator cuff tear. You can do the same thing for the number one muscle that we're going to see torn as far as partial or full thickness tear, and that's the dying test. So we would test the non-symptomatic side first, but for simplicity, I'm just going to show a symptomatic side. You're going to have the patient bring his arm all the way up in a scapular plane, go as far as you can. Now I'm going to push down and he pushes up. Same as the empty can, we're taking through a full range of motion. As I push him down, I'm looking for reproduction of pain or I'm looking for weakness as compared to the good side. And then I also bring him into a fully abductor position as high as you can. I'm going to push down, he's going to push up. Once again, looking for any kind of pain. I recommend checking it out. It's in ChiroUp. If you look in the clinical evaluation section, I'll show you exactly all these tests that we're talking about. Is the internal rotation lag sign. Now, it's not common for the general population, but as someone who leans over people all day long and does this all day long, there is one thing preventing my glenohumeral joint from shooting through the wall behind me is my subscapularis. So one thing you can do with your spouse at home is to check this. You're going to bring your arm behind your body like this, and now I'm going to bring his arm off his body here. I'm going to hold on his elbow, say keep it right here. And he faked that a little bit, but that's what they would do. So you would hold it here, hold it right there, and no, he's not faking it. So he's got some weakness in the subscapularis. I'd be, as someone of his age and mobility, I'd be curious if he had some issues in the subscapularis.
Certainly, speaking of age, that does play a role because
Yes.
degenerated tendons typically degenerate further over time, like any other tissue that degenerates. And Muriel and Walton told us that there were a few things that we really want to look at. That if you have 3 of the 4 following, meaning age over 60, you have supraspinatus weakness as identified by a positive empty can test, you have weakness in resisted external rotation, like a hornblower sign, or you have positive signs of impingement, which remember the signs of impingement that we started with were Neer's and Hawkins-Kennedy tests. If you have 3 out of 4 of those, you have a 98% likelihood of having a full thickness rotator cuff tear. That's about as accurate as an MRI is going to be for identifying that same problem. So like so many of the things that you and I manage, it's no one test that gives us all the answers. It's clusters of information that lead us to the right diagnosis and then the right treatment.
So working with the treatment is we don't go through and we don't treat every single one of the muscles. You're really looking for the muscles that are tight. Remember, if you have a sheath of muscles, 4 muscles going on top of the glenohumeral joint, they're all doing one job of compressing and pulling down the arm. If one of those gives way, if one of those has weakness, the other ones need work a little bit harder. If you take a look at the average male, and the chance of having a partial thickness tear is about the same as his age, we're going to see most of those tears within the supraspinatus. We're going to find a lot of trigger points in that teres minor and also the infraspinatus. But also don't be afraid to dig down to that armpit also. When we have muscles on top being pinched, there's muscles on the bottom that can do a good job of pulling that arm down, one being the subscapularis. Now on females, it's not tough to get to. Our males with hair down there, it's not very pleasant on them and definitely not on us either.
So in order to save tears on this broadcast, we're going to show you the videos of those. And again, we'll give you a QR code at the end. For those of you who are already ChiroUp subscribers, you know how to access these videos. If you're not, we'll give you a QR code that you can access them. And you'll be able to see videos of the 4 rotator cuff muscles as well as the other ones, including the infraspinatus, that muscle that often has the trigger point in it, the subscapularis, probably one of the number 1 or 2 or 3 most overlooked muscles with trigger points that once we address those, the adhesions, trigger points, and irritation, things start to change in the right direction. We've got the supraspinatus, which is oftentimes involved, but that one's usually pretty identifiable. And then the teres minor. So we have videos of how to perform a pin and stretch technique on any of those muscles within ChiroUp. And then the exercises, not surprisingly, are going to be an evolution from what we did with the supraspinatus impingement.
Yeah, so our phase 1 for impingement syndrome is going to look and smell a lot like rotator cuff syndrome because first we need to let things calm down a little bit. So we're still going to see the YTWL, the corner pec stretch, the glenohumeral internal. If you get to the very end, that once you calm things down, The key is now to build things back up. So what we do in our office is we have exercises, video and pictures to now show these people how to now safely build up the exercises, build up the rotator cuff muscles. There are tons of programs out there. There's Buckberger exercises, Kibler exercises. There's a plethora of evidence to show a lot of different programs that work. I have found that these 3 exercises kind of incorporate all those positions and plans for patients and are safe for patients to do. So the first is the eccentric scapular stabilizers, is laying on their side and now eccentrically letting the arm go down into adduction, which will focus on the serratus anterior and lower trapezius. The next one is going to be the external rotators. Having weakness in the external rotators will cause a lot of issues with scapular dyskinesis and ultimately lead to impingement and rotator cuff syndrome. Now having the arm on the side is slowly going down into internal rotation. You want to use a weight that's a little painful, a weight that after 3 sets of 10 repetitions is about all you can do. Remember, rotator cuff muscle is only about the thickness of 2 pens. There's not a lot of muscle girth there. So a weight as far as a male between 5 and 8 pounds should just be about it. And then slowly build that up as you become more sore. The eccentric supraspinatus is the last one, having the arm in full internal rotation and starting at a height that's comfortable for them and going down in the scapular plane and really now putting progressive load across that tissue, building up capacity and resiliency of the fibers around that area.
And one of the things that we always want to accomplish, that there's some debate in the literature as to should we do an isometric, should we do an eccentric exercise? And I think eccentric is still leading the charge. But one thing that is very clear is that it should be a progressive loading program, that we want to start with something that's a moderate effort for the patient, that unlike some things, we're not afraid of causing a little bit of pain because remember, we're trying to initiate a controlled inflammatory reaction. That can be a little uncomfortable initially, controlled being a key word here. But when we initiate that controlled inflammatory reaction, we need them to have a little discomfort. So a 3 or a 4 is acceptable on the pain scale. And then we gradually ramp that up. One of the clinical pearls that I use that I learned from one of our mentors as to how do we measure how much to add more weight onto that patient's program is what did they do the night before? How did they sleep? So if somebody comes in and says, I really had an increase in shoulder pain last night, we pushed too hard the day before, so it's time to step back down. If the patient has 2 or 3 nights where they had no trouble, then we try to ramp that up on a gradual basis. So you let nighttime pain be your gauge for how well are you progressively loading that tendon, regardless of if it's a tendinopathy of shoulder or a medial epicondylopathy, a lateral, a gluteal tendinopathy, which is considered rotator cuff tears of the hip, or a patellar tendinopathy. All of those require a progressive muscular load, and nighttime pain is a great gauge for that process. Just making sure we don't overload it from the start, taking a tissue that's irritated into a tissue that's torn. Better to start a little too light than too heavy.
So the biggest thing for me is how do I get all this information to my patients? That my job as a practitioner is to diagnose patients, but if I just do that and provide blind treatment to my patients, I'm not doing them much of a service. I really need to take everything that I know about a patient and their condition and teach the patient about that. And then if I can make them an active participant in their care, they're often going to find those variables that are ultimately leading to their problem, a hobby, a sport, some kind of activity that's creating this problem to begin with. So make sure when a patient leaves your office, you give them some kind of patient education, whether it's on paper, whether it's on email, whether it's through a portal, whether it's just verbal. The best thing is to give them multiple different platforms. So now when their spouse says, "Hey, John, what happened to you today?" that you can give them a diagnosis and what's going on and what that provider is going to do for them. That's one thing we do here at ChiroUp. Because my goal is to, with developing ChiroUp with Dr. Bertelsman, is to allow you to deliver your information to your patients. Now, we backfill with all the evidence-based information. However, you're allowed to put in your exercises, your treatments, and everything you want to deliver to patients so that it makes it very easy on you to say, yeah, I can recognize rotator cuffs. Let me make sure that I'm giving them the best practice information, how to treat this, and now my patient understands their condition just as well as I do. So that's one thing that I think that having that saves me time and ultimately makes me a better clinician because it allows me to automate the 98% of things that I tell every patient so I can remain creative and curious in my last 2% to look at that patient and find the other things that maybe other practitioners haven't.
So one of the things that you'll want to do here before we wrap up with the last couple of slides is to take a picture of this QR code. If you're already a ChiroUp subscriber, you don't need to do that. If you're not a ChiroUp subscriber, click this QR code or take a picture of the QR code now so that you'll have access to all the things that we'll talk about. The reason that we're here talking today is ironically because of a rotator cuff patient that Mary came in about 10 years ago. I saw her. I was very proud of myself for making the correct diagnosis of shoulder impingement syndrome. And on the third visit, Mary didn't show up. So I asked Debbie, where'd Mary go? And she said, oh, Mary called in. And Mary said that she's not feeling any better. She's not coming back, and she's going to see her doctor. And if you've ever had that feeling, you know that that's no fun, that Mary trusted me to take care of her and I failed. So we decided at that point, we need a better way to assess this. So we went to the literature. We mined out the best practices. We bought textbooks. We went to videos. We talked to our mentors, people like Tom Hyde, to determine what's a better way to manage this. And that was the point in time that two things were coming on board. Number one, we talked a lot more about scapular dyskinesis, the underlying functional deficit that was perpetuating the problem. And number two, we started to learn about treating tendinopathy or degenerated tendons as opposed to inflamed tendons. So the ultrasound and the ice and the rest that I was giving Mary weren't enough to cut it. It wasn't coming just from her neck, so the manipulation wasn't enough. And I learned that I needed to do something different to address that scapular dyskinesis and to use something that creates a controlled inflammatory reaction. That's what the research told us to do. And I realized I needed a better recipe for that condition and for others. Once we started using that better recipe, outcomes changed markedly. And we realized we need to do this for more than one condition. So now we've gone through 105 different conditions, mined out the best practice literature. We have more than 7,000 references to support what's the best way to assess, manage, and empower the patient to become a participant in their recovery through exercises and ADLs. And all of that's available now in ChiroUp. Unfortunately, as part of this seminar, you're able to access that as a fixed member. If you elect to continue with that, you're able to get it at a significant discount and a benefit to fix as well. So once again, take a picture of the QR code. Dr. Steele will give us a quick preview of what you're going to want to look at when you get into the program.
So just going to pull up the share screen.
So we seem to have lost Dr. Bertelsman and Dr. Brandon off the stream, but they should be back shortly. They're just going to share the screen and run through a short ChiroUp demonstration. Here they are back again. Give me one moment. I'll bring them back up for us. Here we go. We lost you.
Sorry.
You're back. No, that's okay.
That was my fault. Share screen.
Perfect. And we had a comment from Mika throughout this, which Mika said, great webinar, Brandon and Tim. Easy to follow and easy to apply. Here we go. I said a screen share, so I'll bring the screen share up right now.
And can you see the screen now, Meg?
Yes, perfect.
So here's our dashboard. The neat thing about this is just what we went through this entire seminar. If you go over this clinical skills section, you're going to see all the 105 references here. So you can go everything from BPPV to Achilles tendinopathy to rotator cuff syndrome. But if there's anything you have a question on, in fact, BPPV is one of our top diagnoses to learn something new about. You can see all the evaluations, all the treatments, all the exercises you can deliver to your patients. If you want to go into more information, you'll appreciate that every single thing that we say, every evaluation, every treatment, every exercise is referenced. So we have the references behind each statement to make sure that it's evidence-based. We also have every evaluation you can possibly think of. And once again, if there's not one that you know of that we don't have, let us know. We'll be happy to put it in. Also, treatment techniques. If you're familiar with nerve flossing, nerve mobilization, manipulation, mobilization, directional preference, all those are in here to help learn different techniques to help different problems. Along with exercise, a lot of people have their own set of exercises. We have most of them. However, if you have any exercise, you can put your own exercise in, or you can let us know what they are, and we actually videotape it with our model, our background. Everything, it doesn't have a logo, so everything it looks like it's coming directly from your clinic, along with different ADL information that you can include with your patients. All of this is great. This is all good stuff that you have in your back pocket. However, like we said, our initial talk is really, it's about how can we deliver this information to our patients. So if this fictitious patient comes in, Emmy Steele comes in, I give her a diagnosis of rotator cuff syndrome. I plug in her name and I click report. So from this, my front desk staff is going to say, okay, Emmy has rotator cuff syndrome. I go to shoulder and find rotator cuff tendinosis, and that's it. It's going to pre-populate my recipe to get her out of pain. So it's going to say I do modalities, myofascial release, and exercise. Every single piece of this is modifiable, or you can add or subtract on the fly, or you can create your recipes in the very beginning, and you never have to touch it again. It's also going to include those strengthening exercises like we talked about in the seminar, and then also my treatment plan. I can modify that as I see fit, and you can include different treatment plans and different messages for that patient. The beauty of this is once you save it, you have multiple different ways of delivering that to the patient. I can actually just copy it and I can put it in my EMR. I can print it, I can email it, or I can do both. For this demonstration, it's going to click print. We're not going to actually print it so you guys can't see it, but it'll pull up a print preview so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. It's going to pull up a chart copy with my logo and all the exercise that I gave to that patient. It's also going to print off an MD initial report. So if you had an MD attached to that patient, it's going to pull off that patient's name, the doctor's name, your diagnosis, and what you're going to do for that patient. So now you can fax this over. Good communication skills with medical doctors goes a long way. We're also going to print off a release report for that patient to help build some trust with the medical doctors in our area to help build a better relationship. It's also going to have in 6th grade language exactly what rotator cuff problem is as far as what they have as far as their diagnosis. It's going to pull off what we're going to do for that patient. Every single piece of this is customizable. So every piece of verbiage, every treatment plan, every ADL, you can modify these to fit your exact practice. And it's also color matched to your practice. It's also going to pull off the ADL information, some of the things that we often forget to tell patients that can help get them through their pain or dysfunction. It's going to have in printed format all their exercises, or they can, since this is the printed version, they can take a picture and scan a QR code, or we have an app associated with it that's branded to your clinic that they can see all their exercises. So as you can stop screen share, there's a lot of different things you can do from this app, but it's really a platform to help give you the best information, the evidence-based information, and then for you now to deliver that information to your patients in a seamless manner. We get paid based off manipulation and evaluation. So we really have to make sure that we're cognizant of how else can we help our patients get through their problems. And through this kind of automation, we can help improve that with our practice. The cool part about delivering these condition reports is 30 days later, they're going to get a survey from you that says, hey, Tim, you saw Dr. Steele. How many times did you see him? What % better are you? How satisfied are you with your care? And on a 0 to 10 scale, how likely are you to refer this practitioner to a friend? If they rate you a 9 or a 10, we send them directly to Google to leave you a Google review online. And then we collect those stats and we can see who's the best provider worldwide. Right now, we have about 2,200 different providers in 9 countries, I think it is.
16.
I was close, 16 countries. And we're sharing data and we're saying who's doing the best job at different conditions. And now we can say, hey, there's something that this person's doing with plantar fasciitis, and they teach us a webinar of what they're doing. That's the way we're going to merge evidence-based practice with evidence-informed practice while still allowing you to practice in any way you see fit, hopefully with your patients in mind first.
Yeah, absolutely. The goal is to be ready for the future of healthcare, having outstanding outcomes with high levels of patient satisfaction and making that affordable. And none of us can do that individually without a team. So we appreciate the researchers. We appreciate all the thousands of doctors in the ChiroUp network who are making that happen. If you're not part of that yet, we'd love to invite you on board. Number one, if you've enjoyed the webinar and would like to see the videos, click the QR code. That takes you into a free trial. If you elect to hang around, there's no credit card required. If you elect to hang around and see value in it, we'll give you ChiroUp for $50 off the monthly subscription, which is a significant discount, and then an ongoing 10% discount thereafter. So this is for fixed members only. We do have to check to make sure you are a fixed member because we don't offer this to everybody. But if you're interested in doing that, we'd love to have you on board. Hopefully, we've been able to share something that enriches your practice to allow you to better assess and manage the rotator cuff. We'll always welcome your questions or suggestions. We're here to learn as much as we are to teach. So by all means, hit us up at tim@chiroup.com or brandon@chiroup.com. We'd be eager to hear your feedback, your suggestions on how to make this better, and any questions you have about us or the product. We appreciate you watching, and we'll look forward to connecting again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim and Brandon, for being here today and for giving that fantastic presentation. It's added so much value to everybody's practice and everybody watching. And as the doctor said, you can jump over to ChiroUp.com/fix referral code or scan that QR code, which is on the screen for that exclusive Fix discount. We'll also put this stream permanently on the Fix website for everybody to refer back to afterwards. So if you'd like to re-refer to it, feel free to rewatch. It's also permanently on our Facebook page, and we'll link through to ChiroUp. So thank you so much for your time and for being here with us again today.
Thanks, Beck.
Thanks, Meg.